Michael Burge is a highly skilled psychologist and the director of the Australian College of Trauma Treatment. He has more than 30 years' experience in psychology, counselling, education and training. During 2010, Michael was given an Australia Day Honours for his service to psychology and the community for his work in trauma. His speciality is PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Our current inquiry into serious allegations of war crimes conducted by the Australian Defence Force, with a focus on the Special Air Service Regiment, the SASR, throws a light onto the trauma and extremities soldiers face during war. With this ADF inquiry report due shortly, I thought it's good to get a perspective from Michael, who's treated many former and current military soldiers. Hi Michael, welcome to TheInformer.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be interviewed by you today, Rochelle. I've been looking forward to contributing to the session today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Can you explain to me, give us layperson's terms, what is PTSD and who's most at risk of suffering it?
Well, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And basically anyone that's exposed to a life-threatening situation or a situation whereby their emotional and physical integrity is threatened, or they witness that happening to somebody else, especially somebody close to them, is susceptible to developing post-traumatic stress and then post-traumatic stress disorder. By the way, 70% of the population across the Western world, at least from the research, 70% of the population has traumatic experience or experiences trauma at some stage in their life. So it's pretty prolific. But in general, as time goes on, most people don't develop PTSD. Around about 10% of the general population develop PTSD. But of course, there are special groups like the military that are around about sometimes, 20 to 30%, depending on the circumstances.
Okay.
The SAS would certainly be in that category.
Yeah. Could you tell me, what's your perspective about this inquiry that the Australian Defence Force is carrying out? Do you think that SASR officers are out of control?
Well, I'd be surprised if that's the case from my experience, because they're one of the most well-trained group within the military, special services, not just in Australia, the Green Berets elsewhere and the Commandos in the UK. So I would say that it'd be most unlikely that it's got anything to do with their training or the lack of discipline, more likely to be an anomaly. In this particular case, I know sometimes morale can be a factor, but generally speaking, when it comes to warfare, especially for the special services, the SAS, you cannot apply civilian type standards to what goes on in war. And in fact, if that actually starts to be imparted to those in active services, it actually makes them more vulnerable to developing PTSD, more vulnerable to morale problems, and also more susceptible to committing atrocities. So I've been reading in the literature, in the media in the last few weeks about this particular case, and there has been a description that part of the morale problems which they suspect is occurring has got to do with the warrior culture. For crying out loud, the SAS, the military, are warriors, and they need to have that well and truly recognised, not just in active service, but on return. It goes back to a tradition which goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and I'd argue that it's innate within us as a civilization to recognise that factor, and also to welcome back the warriors when they return and give them the accolades and the honour they deserve. So let's try and get things into perspective here.
Okay, Michael, accusations and allegations of war crimes, as well as failures of leadership, which are also some of the claims, cut to the very core of the SAS. Surely such actions go against the very purpose of this organisation.
Well, I think you'd find that the SAS training makes it much less likely for them to commit atrocities than, say, the general population of military service. So there would be most unusual, but it does actually happen occasionally. Atrocities happen in all theatres of war, no matter what side you're actually looking at. So it's not impossible, but it can actually happen. People do slip through, but it's much less likely to happen under normal circumstances with the sort of highly regarded training of the SAS services. But it's not impossible, but it can actually happen.
Michael, it's alleged that some of the SAS members have actually done things such as executing innocent people. Now, in your experience dealing with SAS officers, is this part of the culture?
It's not part of the culture at all. It'd be most unusual for that to happen. So if that's going on, then that would be an indicator that something is wrong within the training, something is wrong within the morale, something is wrong in terms of the recruitment process. The SAS go for a stringent recruitment process, and they do know. I do know they go through a psychological profile. Look, I've spent about a year myself in the Army as a civilian lecturer in electronics at one stage prior to getting into psychology. I've had discussions with a number of senior staff within the Army, within the SAS. They go through a rigorous test to see what kind of personality profile they got. But sometimes certain personalities, psychopaths even, do slip through. But it's most unusual. If for example, and we can't comment on this particular case, if, for example, that a psychopath did slip through, they'd be quite capable sometimes of being very clever to actually even perhaps fool the best psychological tests and the best recruitment process. But we've got to look at the circumstances. The other thing we have to take into account is that sometimes in the theatre of war, especially in these sort of wars like that are going on in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, Cambodia, the involvement in there by the peacekeeping forces, other places, it's not like the traditional warfare where you have a front line. You don't know where the enemy is going to pop up from, who's going to be a civilian, who's going to be an actual threat that's going to kill your colleagues or kill innocent civilians that you're trying to protect in Afghanistan. So it's almost chaotic sometimes, and it's very, very difficult for the SAS personnel or the military personnel in general to sometimes pick between those that are actually a direct threat and those that are actually an innocent bystander. When innocent bystanders do get killed, it does happen when there is an atrocity. There's a lot of things from my experience in interviewing these brave warriors that do go wrong from what they've reported to me, what's been reported in the literature. What can go wrong is they can actually have a mental breakdown while they're in actual service, and there's not necessarily the psychological mechanism for them to actually be detected or for them to actually seek the sort of confidence in that you would hope. For example, the psychiatrist in MASH, that great sitcom, which we probably all saw at some stage. In reality, there's not that sort of dynamic taking place. So it's not impossible that a person is suffering from PTSD, an SAS member is suffering from PTSD, they've had a mental breakdown, they're experiencing emotional numbing. And when that happens, their capacity to be rational and their capacity to be someone who has mercy or conscience or somebody who can differentiate between the enemy and a civilian becomes limited. And all sorts of things can go wrong. Displaced aggression. There's a lot of research from Vietnam on displaced aggression. They can get so frustrated and so unsure about who the enemy is, they can sometimes take it out on someone that might be the enemy. And
Michael,
so
how would you explain how SAS members are trained?
Well, I'd like to say that they go through recruitment training, they go through all sorts of tests. They have to actually endure great, if you like, for example, jungle training. They need to actually be able to go jump all sorts of the same meters, all sorts of psychological and physical hurdles that they are at a point of excellence. They have to be almost sometimes superhuman in what they have to be able to achieve. And they're put under the pressure cooker too, in such a way that they are very clear that they have to follow orders. They have to follow the chain of command, because when you're actually involved in life-threatening circumstances, you can't actually sit down and have a group discussion, have a nice warm fuzzy feel, so they have to act accordingly to what's been instructed.
Yeah.
If there's some problems in the chain of command, then that can be a breakdown in that link.
With your experience as a psychologist, even with a highly trained SAS member, what would go through their mind after they've executed someone? Do you know?
Well, there's well documented literature on that. They develop severe post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes termed as complex PTSD. They will suffer from depression, anxiety, a range of psychological conditions, and often there can be a high level of suicidality.
Is that even despite the training?
despite the training afterwards, I've worked with a number of SAS personnel that have had those symptoms, had those reactions. The guilt and remorse that wasn't there at the time can then re-emerge afterwards. If you like, once the dissociation, which is a symptom of PTSD, once the emotional numbing starts to wear off, then they're actually faced with the reality of what they've been through, not just with atrocities, but also with having some kind of close contact with the enemy, whereby they saw them face to face and then killed them.
Do you think
So
you
this caused a
can
moral dilemma.
apply civilian law to the abnormalities of war?
Absolutely not. You cannot apply civilian law to what goes on in a situation which is so chaotic, and there's friends dying left of you, friends dying right of you, friends dying in front of you, people being blown apart. It's right back to primitive tribal type stuff, and the training helps channel that in the right sort of way. So you absolutely cannot apply that sort of analogy to warfare. In fact, if you do, and that flows through to uncertainty and ambiguity in what needs to be done during the actual operational activity, that makes things more likely to go wrong, makes it more likely for there to be atrocities, and makes it more likely that people will be killed in active service in either circumstances, and makes it more likely for people to suffer from post-traumatic stress and other psychological conditions later on, when they return home.
Michael, do you think the issue is the fact that Australia's been fighting this war, a 10-year campaign in the Middle East, with no clear definition of victory? Is that part of this issue?
That's always a factor. Yes, that's always a factor. It's well known that from the example there, we often look at the Vietnam War in particular. It can be going on, and there's no particular clarity on where the winning is going to take place, where the victories are going to take place. 2 steps forward, 5 steps back. Sometimes you have a bit of a pocket here and a pocket there of satisfaction, and it contributes to the chaos and ambiguity. And with that, any kind of mental harm that is being done to the troops is more likely to be amplified, unfortunately. So it's just something people would need to actually be there or work directly with these brave people to understand what's going on. And even then, you wouldn't necessarily understand it. They're the ones that really truly understand from what they go through, which is enormous. So if we add enormous bravery and enormous courage, and that needs to be the forefront of any inquiry, it needs to be balanced with what has been achieved, what the purpose of them being in the first place in Afghanistan or other theatres of war. They're there for noble reasons to defend our way of life in different parts of the world, and that should be well and truly upfront with whatever kind of inquiry is taking place into individuals or groups when things go wrong.
What action
Otherwise, we're
do you
going to be in
think?
trouble.
What action should be taken? Do you think, with SAS members and operatives that do step outside their roles?
Well, I think you need to take if people who do commit atrocities, clearly there needs to be some consequences. That's well and truly been proved. But like in civil war, even if you have civil law, if someone who is suffering from post-traumatic stress, for example, doesn't have to be someone who is from the military, it could be the police, could be the CFA workers, and they commit a crime of some kind, a violent crime, there's always PTSD and other mental health conditions. There's always a mitigation of whatever sentence is imposed upon that. So clearly, I think one needs to take into account us as a society, civilization, the lawmakers, the adjudicators need to take into account what those individuals have been through that has contributed to sometimes atrocious actions, committing atrocities.
Finally, Michael, what are your expectations of the findings of this inquiry that is about to be released?
Well, look, the comment I would make is that my expectation is that they would take into account those things that I just mentioned to you, those dynamics, those factors. That if that person has been proven to have done an atrocity, committed an atrocity, has that person been suffering from PTSD? Did he get the right sort of support at the time? Is there some kind of displaced aggression taking place through the frustration and the uncertainty of warfare? Are there other factors at work there? Has there been some kind of pressure sometimes if there's been a psychopath has slipped through the net in command, and they may be sort of pressurising other people to do these acts, but will they stay clear themselves? What's going on that's contributing to these factors, that's contributing to this atrocity if it did take place? And I think that needs to be taken into account in any kind of sentence, any kind of outcome. If it's an unfair, or if those sorts of warfare activities are dismissed, those brave activities are dismissed, or the whole SAS is judged poorly, it works against people acting in the right sort of way, acting in the way they need to act according to their training, and in fact more likely to commit more atrocities, ironically enough. So we need to really take that into account.
Thank you for your time today, Michael.
It's my pleasure.